Welcome back, everybody. Today we will be reading Chapter 14 of The Magicians, so let's get into it. Chapter 14, Graduation. In a way, it was a disaster of a vacation. They hardly even went outside except for a few walks, undertaken at a brisk trot, through the freeze-dried Urbania suburbs, so flat and empty it felt like at any moment they could fall off into the immense white sky. But in other ways, it was perfect. It brought Alice and Quentin closer together. It helped Quentin understand why she was the way she was. They didn't fight once. If anything, the terrifying counterexample of Alice's parents made them feel young and romantic by contrast. And after the first week, they'd finished all their homework and were free to lie around and goof off. By the time 2 weeks were up, they were thoroughly stir-crazy and ready to start their last semester at Brakebills. They'd heard almost nothing from the others since last summer. Quentin hadn't really expected to. Of course, he was curious about what was going on in the outside world, but he had the idea that Elliot and Josh and Janet were busy ascending to some inconceivable new level of coolness, as far above Brakebills as Brakebills was above Brooklyn or Chesterton. And he would have felt let down if they'd still had the time and inclination to bother keeping in touch with him. As far as he could deduce from their scattered reports, they were all living together in an apartment in downtown Manhattan. The only decent correspondent among them was Janet, who every couple of weeks sent the cheesiest I Love New York postcard she could find. She wrote in all caps and kept the punctuation to a minimum. Dear Q&A, we three went to Chinatown last week to look for herbs. Elliot bought a Mongolian spell book. It's in Mongolian, duh, but he claims he can read it, but I think it's Mongolian porno. Josh bought a little green baby turtle. He named it Gamera after the monster. He is growing a beard. Josh, not Gamera. You guys, the rest was in tiny, barely legible script overflowing vertically into the space for the address. Have got to get here. Brakebills is a small pond, and in NYC is the ocean, and Elliot is drinking like a fish. Stop it, Elliot. Stop it. I kill you for this. I kill you 1,000 times. Illegible. So much love. Jay. Despite widespread popular resistance, or possibly because of it, Dean Fogg entered Brakebills in an international welters tournament, and Quentin traveled to overseas magic schools for the first time, though he didn't see much of them beyond the welters' court, and once in a while a dining hall. They played in the emerald green courtyard of a medieval keep in the misty Carpathians, and at a compound bushwhacked out of the seemingly endless Argentine pampas. On Rishiki Island, off the northern coast of Hokkaido, they played on the most beautiful welter's court Quentin had ever seen. The sand squares were a searing white and perfectly scraped and leveled. The grass squares were lime green and clipped to a regulation 12 millimeter. The water squares steamed darkly in the chilly air. Frowning, uncannily humanoid monkeys watched them play, clinging to wiggly pine trees, their bare pink faces ringed with nimbi of snowy white fur. But Quentin's world tour was cut short when, to Professor Fogg's acute embarrassment, the Brakebills team lost all 6 of its first 6 matchups, and it exited the tournament. Their perfect losing record was preserved forever when they were crushed at home in the first round of the consolation bracket by a pan-European team captained by a tiny, fiery, curly-haired Luxembourgeois, on whom Quentin, along with every other boy on the Breakbills team and some of the girls, developed an instant crush. The Welter season ended on the last day of March, and suddenly Quentin found himself staring at the end of his Breakbills career across a perilously slender gap of only 2 months of time. It was like he'd been winding his way through a very glittering city, zigzagging through side streets and wandering through buildings and haunted de Chirico arcades, and little hidden piazzas, the whole time thinking that he'd barely scratched the surface, that he was seeing just a tiny sliver of one little neighborhood, and then suddenly he turned a corner, and it turned out he'd been through the whole city. It was all behind him, and all that was left was one short street leading straight out of town. Now, the most insignificant things Quentin did felt momentous, brimming over with anticipatory nostalgia. He'd be passing by a window at the back of the house, hurrying between classes, and a tiny movement would catch his eye. A distant figure trudging across the sea in a Breakbills jacket, or a gawky topiary flamingo fuzzily shedding the cap of snow on its little green head. And he would realize that he would never see that particular movement ever again, or if he did, he would see it in some future time as some unimaginably different person. And then there were the other moments, when he was violently sick of Breakbills and everything and everyone in it, when it felt lame and pokey and claustrophobic, and he was desperate to get out. In 4 years, he'd barely even set foot off the Breakbills campus. My God, he was wearing a school uniform. He'd essentially just spent 4 extra years in a high school. Students had a particular way of speaking at Breakbills, an affected, overly precise, quasi-British diction that came from all those vocal exercises, like they were just freshly back from a Rhodes Scholarship and wanted everybody to know it. It made Quentin want to lay about him with an edged weapon, and there was this obsession with naming things. All the rooms at Breakbills had the same identical desk, a broad-shouldered black cherrywood hulk that must have been ordered up in bulk sometime in the second half of the 19th century. It was honeycombed with little drawers and cubbies and pigeonholes. And each of those drawers and cubbies and pigeonholes had its own precious little name. Every time Quentin heard somebody drop a reference to the ink chink and the old dean's ear, he rolled his eyes at Alice. Sweet Jesus, are they serious? We have got to get out of this place. But where was he going to go exactly? It was not considered the thing to look panicked or even especially concerned about graduation, but everything about the world after Breakbills felt dangerously vague and underthought to Quentin. The bored, bedraggled specters of Alice's parents haunted him. What was he going to do? What exactly? Every ambition he'd ever had in his life had been realized the day he was admitted to Breakbills, and he was struggling to formulate a new one with any kind of practical specificity. This wasn't Fillory, where there was some magical war to be fought. There was no watcher-woman to be rooted out, no great evil to be vanquished, and without that, everything else seemed so mundane and penny-ante. No one would come right out and say it, but the worldwide magical ecology was suffering from a serious imbalance. Too many magicians, not enough monsters. It made it worse that he was the only one who seemed to be bothered by it. Lots of students were already actively networking with established magical organizations. Sorinda lectured anybody who would listen about a consortium of wizards, whom he hadn't actually heard from yet, but he was pretty sure they'd basically guaranteed him an internship, who spent their time at suborbital altitudes keeping a weather eye out for stray asteroids and oversized solar flares, and other potential planetary scale disasters. Plenty of students went in for academic research. Alice was looking at a postgraduate program in Glasgow, though the idea of being separated didn't particularly appeal to either of them, nor did the idea of Quentin's aimlessly tagging along with her to Scotland. It was considered chic to go undercover, to infiltrate governments and think tanks and NGOs, even the military, in order to get oneself into a position to influence real-world affairs, magically from behind the scenes. People devoted years of their lives to it, and there were even more exotic paths. A few magicians, illusionists in particular, undertook massive art projects, manipulating the northern lights and things like that, decades-long enchantments that might only ever have an audience of one. There was an extensive network of war games who staged annual global conflicts over arbitrary tactical objectives, just for the fun of it. Sorcerers against sorcerers, and teams in free-for-all battle royale. They played without safeguards, and it was well known that one in a blue moon someone got killed. But that was half the fun of it, the thrill. And it all sounded completely horribly plausible. Any one of the 1,000 options promised, basically guaranteed, a rich, fulfilling, challenging future for him. So why did Quentin feel like he was looking around frantically for another way out? Why was he still waiting for some grand adventure to come and find him? He was drowning. Why did he recoil whenever anybody reached down to help him? The professors Quentin talked to about it didn't seem concerned at all. They didn't get what the problem was. What should he do? Why, anything he wanted to. Meanwhile, Quentin and Alice plugged away at their mandatory senior thesis with steadily diminishing enthusiasm. Alice was attempting to isolate an individual photon and freeze it in place, halting its headlong light-speed flight. She constructed an intricate trap for it out of wood and glass, interwoven with a hellishly complex spherical tangle of glowing indigo gramarye. Gramire. But in the end, nobody was quite sure whether the photon was in there or not, and they couldn't figure out how to prove it one way or the other. Privately, Alice confessed to Quentin that she wasn't totally sure either, and she was genuinely hoping the faculty could settle it one way or the other, because it was driving her insane. After a week of increasingly fractious debate that settled nothing, they voted to give Alice the lowest possible passing grade and leave it at that. For his project, Quentin planned to fly to the moon and back. Distance-wise, he figured he could get there in a couple of days. Straight shot, and after his Antarctic adventure, he was pretty solid on personal warmth spells. Though they weren't his discipline either. He'd just about given up on his discipline. And the idea had a certain romantic, lyrical savor to it. He took off from the sea on a bright, hot, humid spring morning, with Alice and Gretchen and a couple of more sarcophanetic new physical kids to see him off. The protection spells formed a clear bubble around him. Sounds became distorted, and the green lawn of the smiling faces of his well-wishers took on a selfish fish-eye warp. As he rose, the earth gradually changed from an infinite matte plane below him to a radiant, bounded blue sphere. Overhead, the stars came out and became sharper and steelier and less twinkly. 6 hours into the trip, his throat suddenly clamped shut, and iron nails stabbed his eardrums. His eyeballs tried to pry themselves out of their sockets. He had drifted off, and his improvised space bubble had started to fail. Quentin waved his arms like a frantic conductor. Prestissimo, and the air thickened and warmed again. But by then, the fun had gone out of the whole thing. Bouts of shivering and wheezing and nervous laughter rattled him, and he couldn't calm down. Jesus, he thought, was there ever anything less worth risking his life for than this? God knows how much interstellar radiation he'd already absorbed. Space was full of angry little particles. He reversed course. He considered hiding out for a few days and just pretending he'd gone to the moon. Maybe he could score some moon dust off Lovelady, present it as evidence. The air got warmer again. The sky grew lighter. He relaxed as a cocktail of relief and shame filled him, one generous part of each. The world spread out again underneath him, the frantically detailed coastline, the blue water textured like beaten metal, the becoming claw of Cape Cod. The worst part turned out to be walking into the great hall for dinner that night, 2 days early, with a sheepishly, "yeah, I fucked up" grin plastered on his face, which was sunburned and flaming red. After dinner, he borrowed Alice's key and retreated to the prefect's common room, where he drank too much sherry, sipping it alone in front of the darkened window, even though all he could see was his own reflection, picturing the Hudson River moving past in the darkness, sluggish and swollen, with cold spring rain. Alice was studying up in her room. Everybody else was asleep except for a lone weeknight party that was racketing on in one wing, spinning off drunk students in pairs and groups. When he was thoroughly smashed on self-pity and alcohol, and the dawn was threatening to leap up at him at any moment, Quentin walked gingerly back to his bedroom. Climbing the spiral steps past what used to be Elliot's room, he weaved a little bit, swigging directly from the sherry bottle, which he'd liberated on his way out. He felt his intoxication already turning into a hangover, that queasy neurological alchemy that usually happens during sleep. His abdomen was overfull, swollen with tainted viscera. People he'd betrayed came wandering out from the place in his mind where they usually stayed. His parents, James, Julia, Professor March, Amanda Orlov, even old dead Mr. What's-His-Name, his Princeton interviewer. They all watched him dispassionately. He was beneath their contempt. He lay down on his bed with the light on. Wasn't there a spell for making yourself happy? Somebody must have invented one. How could he have missed it? Why didn't they teach it? Was it in the library, a flying book fluttering just out of reach, beating its wings against some high window? He felt the bed slipping down and away, like a film loop of a Stuka shearing down into an attack run, over and over again. He'd been so young when he first came here. He thought about that freezing day in November when he'd taken the book from the lovely paramedic, and the note had blown away into that dry, twisted, frozen garden, and he'd gone blithely, running after it. Now he'd never know what it said. Had it contained all the riches, all the good feeling that he was still somehow missing, even after so much goodness had been heaped upon him? Was it the secret revelation of Martin Chatwin, the boy who had escaped into Fillory and never returned to face the misery of this world? Because he was drunk, he thought about his mother, and how she'd held him once when he was little, after he'd lost an action figure down a storm drain, and he smushed his red, smarting face into his cool pillow and sobbed as if his heart were broken. By then, there were only 2 weeks left until graduation. Classwork ground to a halt. The maze was a vivid, verdant, glowing green knot. The air was full of floaty little motes, and siren-like pleasure craft came drifting down the river past the boathouse, laden with oblivious sunbathers. All anybody talked about was how great it would be when they could party and sleep in an experiment with forbidden spells. They kept looking at each other and laughing and slapping each other on the back and shaking their heads. The carousel was slowing down. The music had almost stopped. Pranks were organized. A decent last day of Pompeii vibe swept through the dorms. Somebody thought up a new game involving dice and a lightly enchanted mirror that was basically a magical version of strip poker. Desperate, ill-advised attempts were made to sleep with that one person with whom one had already secretly, hopelessly wanted to sleep with. The graduation ceremony started at 6 in the afternoon, with the sky still heavy with fading golden light. An 11-course banquet was served in the dining halls. The 19 graduating fifth years regarded one another with awe, feeling lost and alone at the long, empty dining table. Red wine was served from bottles without labels. It was made, Fogg revealed, using grapes from Breakbill's own tiny pocket vineyard, which Quentin had stumbled on in the fall of his first year. Traditionally, the vineyard's entire output was drunk by the seniors at graduation dinner. Had to be drunk, Fogg stressed, hinting darkly at what would happen if a single bottle was left unconsumed. It was a Cabernet Sauvignon, and it was thin and sour, but they quaffed it lustily anyway. Quentin declaimed a lengthy tribute to its subtle expression of the unique Breakbill's terrier. Toasts were drunk to the memory of Amanda Orlov, and the glasses hurled into the fireplace to ensure that no lesser toast would ever be drunk from them. When the wind blew, the candles flickered and dropped molten beeswax onto the fresh white tablecloth. Along with the cheese course, they were each presented with a silver bee pin, identical to the ones the prefects wore. Quentin was at a loss to imagine any occasion on which it would be even remotely appropriate to wear it, and a heavy black two-toothed iron key that would permit them to return to Breakbills if they ever needed to. School songs were sung, and Chambers served scotch, which Quentin had never had before. He tipped his little tumbler of it from side to side, watching the light drift through the mysterious amber fluid. It was amazing that anything in liquid form could taste that much like both smoke and fire. He leaned over to Georgia and started to explain this fascinating conundrum to her, but as he did so, Fogg stood up at the head of the table, strangely grave, dismissed Chambers, and asked the fifth years to follow him downstairs. This was unexpected. Downstairs meant the cellar, where Quentin had almost never been in his whole time at Breakbills, just once or twice to sneak a particularly coveted bottle from the wine cellar, or when he and Alice had been desperate for privacy. But now, Professor Fogg led them in a loose bantering, occasionally singing Flock back through the kitchen, through a small, unassuming door in the pantry, and down a flight of worn and dusty wooden stairs that changed mid-flight into stone. They emerged into a dark, earthy sub-basement. This wasn't where Quentin had thought the party was going. It wasn't a party atmosphere at all. It was cool down here, and suddenly quiet. The floor was dirt, the ceilings were low, and the walls were bumpy and unfinished. They devoured sound. Voice by voice, the chorus of a traditional Breakbill song, an elaborately euphemistic number entitled "The Perfect Has a Defect," died away. There was a grave but not unpleasant smell of damp soil. Fogg stopped at what looked like a manhole cover embedded in the dirt floor. It was brass and densely inscribed with calligraphic writing. Oddly, it looked as shiny and new as a freshly struck coin. The dean picked up a heavy manhole tool and, with an effort, levered it up the brass disc. It was 2 inches thick, and it took 3 of the 5 years to roll it to one side. "After you," the dean said, panting a little. He gestured grandly at the inky black hole. Quentin went first. He felt around blindly with the scotch benumbed feet till he found an iron rung. It was like lowering himself into warm black oil. The ladder took him and the other graduates straight down into a circular chamber large enough for all 19 of them to stand upright in a circle, which they did. Fogg came down last. They could hear him screwing the manhole cover back into place behind them. Then he descended too, and with a crash, he sent the ladder retracting back up, like a fire escape. After that, the silence was absolute. "No point in losing our momentum," Fogg said. He lit a candle and gamely produced 2/5 of bourbon from somewhere and set them going in opposite directions around the circle. Something about this gesture unnerved Quentin. There was a certain amount of sanctioned alcohol consumption at Breakbills, a fairly large amount, really, but this was a bit much. There was something forced about it. Well, it was graduation. They weren't students anymore. They were grown-ups, just peers sharing a drink, in a secret underground dungeon, in the middle of the night. Quentin took his swig and passed it on. Dean Fogg lit more candles in assorted brass candlesticks, making a circle within their larger circle. They couldn't have been more than 50 yards down, but it felt like they were a solid mile beneath the earth, entombed alive, forgotten by the rest of the world. "In case you're wondering why we're down here," Fogg said, "it's because I wanted to get us outside the Breakbills' protective cordon. That's a defensive magical barrier that extends out from the house in all directions. That inscribed brass hatch we opened was a gateway through it." The darkness swallowed his words as soon as he uttered them. "It's a little unsettling, yes? But it's appropriate, because unlike me, you'll be spending the rest of your lives out here. Most years, the point of coming down here is to scare you with ghost stories about the outside world. In your case, I don't think that will be necessary. You've witnessed firsthand the destructive power that some magical entities possess. It's unlikely you'll ever see anything as bad as what happened on the day of the beast. But remember that what happened that day can happen again. Those of you who were in the auditorium that day, especially, will carry the mark of it forever. You will never forget the beast, and you can be sure it won't forget you either. Forgive me if I lecture you, but it's the last chance I'm going to get." Quentin was sitting opposite Fogg in the circle. They had all taken seats on the smooth stone floor, and his mild, clean-shaven face floated in the darkness like an apparition. Both bottles of whiskey reached Quentin simultaneously, and he gamely took a sip from each, one in each hand, and passed them on. "Sometimes I wonder if man was really meant to discover magic," Fogg said expansively. "It doesn't really make sense. It's a little too perfect, don't you think? If there's a single lesson that life teaches us, it's that wishing doesn't make it so. Words and thoughts don't change anything. Language and reality are kept strictly apart. Reality is tough, unyielding stuff, and it doesn't care what you think or feel or say about it, or it shouldn't. You deal with it, and you get on with your life. Little children don't know that. Magical thinking, that's what Freud called it. Once we learn otherwise, we cease to be children. The separation of word and thing is the essential fact on which our adult lives are founded. But somewhere in the heat of magic, that boundary between word and thing ruptures. It cracks, and the one flows back into the other, and the two melt together and fuse. Language gets tangled up with the world it describes. I sometimes feel as though we've stumbled on a flaw in the system, don't you? A short circuit, a category error, a strange loop. It is possible that magic is knowledge that would be better off forsworn. Tell me this. Can a man who can cast a spell ever really grow up? He paused. No one answered. What the hell would they say? It was a little late to be scolding them now that they'd already completed their magical education. I have a little theory that I'd like to air here, if I may. What is it that you think makes you magicians? More silence. Fogg was well into rhetorical question territory now anyway. He spoke more softly. It is because is it because you are intelligent? Is it because you are brave and good? Is it because you're special? Maybe. Who knows? But I'll tell you something. I think you're magicians because you're unhappy. A magician is strong because he feels pain. He feels the difference between what the world is and what he would make of it. Or what did you think that stuff in your chest was? A magician is strong because he hurts more than others. His wound is his strength. Most people carry that pain around inside them their whole lives, until they kill the pain by other means, or until it kills them. But you, my friends, you found another way. A way to use the pain, to burn it as fuel, for light and warmth. You have learned to break the world that has tried to break you. Quentin's attention wandered to the tiny glimmery points of light here and there on the curved ceiling above them, pricking out the shapes of constellations he didn't recognize, as if they were on another planet, seeing the stars from an alien angle. Someone cleared his throat. Fogg went on. But just in case that's not enough, each one of you will leave this room tonight with an insurance policy. A pentagram tattooed on your back, 5-pointed star, nicely decorative. Plus, it acts as a holding cell for a demon, a small but rather vicious little fellow. Cock-a-demon, technically. They're tough little scrappers, skin like iron. In fact, I think they may be made of iron. I'll give you each a password that sets him free. Speak the password and he'll pop out and fight for you till he's dead, or till whoever's giving you trouble is. Fogg clapped his hands on his knees and looked at them as if he'd just told them they'd all be receiving a year's supply of attractive and useful break-bill stationery. Georgia put up her hand tentatively. Is this optional? I mean, is anybody else besides me disturbed by the idea of having an angry demon, trapped inside their skin? If that bothers you, Georgia, Fogg said curtly, then you should have gone to beauty school. Don't worry. He'll be grateful as hell, so to speak, when you set him free. He's only good for one fight, though, so pick your moment. That's the other reason we're down here, by the way. Can't conjure a cock-a-demon inside the cordon. Why we need the bourbon, too, because this is going to hurt like a bitch. Now, who's first? Or shall we go alphabetically? The next morning at 10, there was a more conventional graduation ceremony in the largest and grandest of the lecture halls. It would be difficult to imagine a more miserable and visibly hungover group of graduating seniors. It was one of the rare occasions when parents were allowed on campus, so no displays of magic or mentions of same were allowed. Almost as bad as the hangover was the pain from the tattoo. Quentin's back felt like it was crawling with hungry, biting insects that had stumbled on something especially delicious. He was exquisitely conscious of his mother and father sitting a dozen rows behind him. Quentin's memories of the night before were confused. The dean had summoned the demons himself, scribbling concentric rings of sigils on the old stone floor with thick chunks of white chalk. He worked quickly and surely with both hands at once. For the tattooing, the guys took off their shirts and jackets and lined up naked to the waist, as did the girls with varying degrees of modesty. Some of them clutched their crumpled clothes over their chests. A few exhibitionists stripped down proudly. In the half-darkness, Quentin couldn't see what Fogg was using to draw on their skin, something slim and glinting. The designs were intricate and had strange, shifting optical qualities. The pain was astonishing, like fog was flaying the skin off their backs and dressing the wounds with salt. But the pain was offset by the fear of what was coming, the moment when he implanted the demon. When they were all ready, Fog built a low dome of loose glowing embers in the center of the sigil rings, and the room got hot and humid. Blood and smoke and sweat were in the air, and an orgiastic fever. When it was the first girl's turn, going alphabetically, that was Alsop, Gretchen. Fog donned an iron gauntlet and rummaged around in the coals till he got a grip on something. The red glow lit up Fog's face from below, and maybe it was just the distortions of memory and alcohol, but Quentin thought he saw something there that he hadn't seen since his first day at Breakbills, something drunken and cruel and unfatherly. When he had hold of what he was looking for, he heaved, and out of the embers it came, a demon, trailing sparks, heavy and dog-size and pissed off. In the same motion he crammed it, wriggling, into Gretchen's slender back. He had to go back and stuff one flailing, sticking out limb back in. She gasped, her whole body tensed, like she'd had freezing water dumped over her, and then she just looked puzzled, twisting to look over her shoulder, forgetting for a second and letting everyone see her slight, pale-nippled breasts. Because, as Quentin discovered when it was his turn, there was no sensation at all. It all felt like a dream now, though of course the first thing Quentin did that morning was check out his back in the mirror. There it was, the huge five-pointed star in thick black outline, raw and red and slightly off-center to the left. He supposed it must be positioned more or less exactly with his heart at its center. Segments of the star were dense with fine squiggly black writing, and smaller stars and crescent moons and other less easily identifiable icons. He looked like he hadn't been so much tattooed as notarized or stamped like a passport. Tired, achy, and hungover as he was, he smiled at it in the mirror. The overall effect was completely badass. When it was all over, they shuffled out of the auditorium into the old hallway. If they'd had caps, they might have thrown them in the air, but they didn't. There was a low hum of conversation, a couple of whoops, but that was really it. It was over. There was nothing else. If they hadn't been graduated last night, they sure were now. They could go anywhere, do anything they wanted. This was it, the big send-off. Alice and Quentin drifted out a side door and wandered over to a huge spreading oak, swinging their held hands between them. There was no wind. The sunlight was too bright. Quentin's head throbbed. His parents were in the vicinity, and he'd have to go look for them in a second. Or maybe they could come looking for him for once in their lives. There would be parties tonight, he supposed, but he was already pretty much partied out. He didn't feel like packing up his things, didn't feel like going back to Chesterton or Brooklyn or anywhere else for that matter. He didn't feel like staying, and he didn't feel like going. He stole a glance at Alice. She looked piqued. He performed a mental search for the love he was accustomed to feel for her and found it strangely absent. If there was anything he wanted at that moment, it was to be alone, but he wasn't going to get that. These were bad thoughts, but he couldn't or wouldn't stop the flow. Staunch and cerebral hemorrhage. Here he was, a freshly licensed and bonded and accredited magician. He had learned to cast spells, seen the beast and lived, flown to Antarctica on his own two wings and returned naked by the sheer force of his magical will. He had an iron demon in his back. Who would ever have thought he could do and have and be all those things and still feel nothing at all? What was he missing? Or was it him? If he wasn't happy even here, even now, did the flaw lie in him? As soon as he seized happiness, it dispersed and reappeared somewhere else. Like Fillory, like everything good, it never lasted. What a terrible thing to know. I got my heart's desire, he thought, and there my troubles began. We have our whole lives ahead of us, and all I want to do is take a nap, Alice said. There was a soft sound behind them, a soap bubble popping, an intake of breath, a wing beat. Quentin turned around, and they were all there. Josh, with a fringe of blonde beard that made him look more than ever like a genial smiling abbot. Janet had gotten her nose pierced, and probably other parts of her. Elliot wore sunglasses, which he had never done at Breakbills, and a shirt of amazing, indescribable perfection. There was somebody else with them, too, a stranger, a serious, slightly older man, tall and darkly bookishly handsome. "Get your stuff together," Josh said. He grinned even more widely and spread out his arms like a prophet. "We're going to take you away from all this." And that's the end for today. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 15.